Most of the products out there are overdosing people. Yeah. I mean, not like, I don't think it's going to be like an overdose like you need to go to the hospital kind of thing, but it's more overdose in the sense of you have to go low and slow under most circumstances unless...
Dr. Scott Sherr, you are one of the world's leading experts on methylene blue, at least in my opinion. You've talked about this stuff for a decade. And now we're at a point where RFK's talking about it, Rogan's talking about it. Like methylene blue is trending hard, and there's a lot of information, misinformation. It's wild out there. So I wanted to get straight to the source. So first and foremost, what is methylene blue, like at the very core level?
I put a link down below for 30% off through Thrive Market. You know what I like about Thrive Market, and I'm going to be very real with you, is that just because something is allowed on a grocery store shelf or something is allowed in a food product because it's generally recognized as safe, doesn't mean that it's good for us. Just because there haven't been studies that show that it really harms people doesn't mean that there isn't evidence that it might not be really good for us. And most of us, 99% of us, don't have the ability to go into a grocery store and know how something really affects our body, right? The thing I like about Thrive Market is that the foods that are on their shelves, digitally speaking, are good quality foods, and they have people that put their best foot forward to really find good quality food that's sustainable, that doesn't have hidden nasty ingredients, and is now accessible and a lot of times more affordable than most grocery stores. So that's what I respect about them. Whether you want snack foods, whether you want something that's more wholesome, whether you want something that you want to use in a meal or spices or a treat, they have it all. So that link is for 30% off your entire first grocery order and a free $60 gift. It gets delivered right to your doorstep. The quality of the food is awesome, and they're out there for a really, truly good cause, which is why I'm a fan of them and why I've supported them for all these years. So that link is down below.
Sure. So, well, thanks for having me back, Thomas. It's good to see you again. It's been 5 years since the company started making products with methylene blue in them. And so it's been a fun journey for me clinically to see how impactful they have been and how much they're doing for so many people. But it is an interesting story. It's a fun story and kind of a crazy one at the same time. So methylene blue started off as a textile dye, and it was developed as it's actually fully synthetic, and that's important for people to realize. It's a fully synthetic dye that was developed in the 1870s, and it used to dye blue jeans blue. So if you had blue jeans in the 1870s and they were blue, they were likely dyed with methylene blue. So it is a synthetic chemical, and at the time, what they were really trying to figure out was how they could treat infections, actually. This class of dye called the thiazine dye, they figured out actually treated malaria, and it got this name of being called actually a magic bullet at the time. A magic bullet, they called it that because you could give very high doses of methylene blue and it would kill pathogens. But at the same time, it wouldn't harm the human host. And in 1897, it became the first drug registered with the FDA. And so, yes, let's get it out of the way. It's a synthetic compound. And does that mean that everything that's synthetic is bad for us? No. Does that mean everything that's natural is also good for us? The answer is no. Like when I was in medical school, I saw people die of liver failure because they were foraging for the wrong mushrooms. And so we know that not everything natural is good for us. And then we live in a synthetic world. And so now, especially because of all of our synthetic inputs at all the time, we need things that may not be from nature to help us. And methylene blue is one of those things. And so at its base, it is a synthetic compound that is blue. Very, very blue. And so between 1897 and around 1950s, it was really an antimicrobial at the time. That was its main function. And back through World War II, pilots and other people in the Pacific theater had to take methylene blue prophylactically to prevent infections overall. And so they had all these songs about the beneficial yet surprising side effect of having blue urine. So what do I mean by beneficial is that because methylene blue concentrated in the urine, it was actually used for urinary tract infections at that time. And so, but after the 1950s or so, antibiotics came around and antimicrobials overall, like penicillin and things like that. And so it became less interesting or less exciting for people to have blue urine overall. And so from there, methylene blue has a different story entirely. Then it becomes the first drug that was used as an antipsychotic, actually, because it has a capacity called monoamine oxidase inhibition. From there, it became a laboratory molecule where they'd use it to actually stain parts of the cell, specifically the mitochondria. And from there, it became understood that it was having this amazing effect on hemoglobin and oxygen carrying capacity, as well as in the mitochondria itself. And over the last several decades, especially, there's been a lot more interest outside of the medical mainstream because this has been around for a long time now. a lot of interest in how it can compensate for mitochondrial dysfunction, which, as you know, is rampant in this country and around the world.
First thing that comes to mind, I think people might have concern with, though, I want to like get out there.
Yeah.
Okay, if it's making your urine blue, is it making your bladder blue? Is it making like what, it's a dye? Is it going to dye organs? And I know there's been some concern about that.
Yes.
So I want to get that out on the front.
Yeah, let's get that out of the way. So there's a recent paper that's been floating around the internets and socials and things about blue brains and things like that. And so methylene blue is used as a rescue agent for severe septic shock, for multi-organ failure, and for pulseless electroelectric activity, so PEA arrest, basically. And so at those circumstances, you can use extremely high doses of methylene blue, IV, very, very, as a kind of a last-ditch effort to help these people. And in those circumstances, there's this paper that's being floating around that the brain was blue after administration. And that's not surprising given how high of a dose they were giving. This is 2-3 milligrams per kilogram. This is huge amounts of methylene blue compared to what we use clinically, which is like 4, 8, 16, 25 milligrams in total, instead of something 3 milligrams per kilogram, which would be like 210 milligrams IV, which is a huge amount. And they did autopsies on these people about 3 to 5 hours to 25 to 24 hours after the actual administration of the IV. And so these low doses, no, they do not have this effect. They do concentrate in the mitochondria. So they do temporarily increase the blueness of your mitochondria, for sure, as the mitochondria are processing the methylene blue and using it in various ways. Methylene blue is always in this cycle. It always goes from being blue to being colorless, depending on its state. That's called its redox state. And so when you're urinating blue, you're urinating out all the blue. You're not getting any remaining blue in the system. The blue is not something that's staining your bladder. It's not staining your brain. It's not staining any other organ. You don't have to worry. Very, very low doses are very safe. And this is a well-established molecule or compound that's been around for over 100 years, as we talked about. And we know how the safety profile of it, and we know it's fantastic. And so it was fantastic clickbait out there for everybody to take a look at. But if you read the paper, it's absolutely ridiculous that you'd even think that these lower doses of methylene blue would have any problem at all. But at the same time, I do get that people see the shock value of seeing a blue brain and get worried about that. But if you have severe septic shock and you're just about to die, then it's probably worth having 3 milligrams per kilogram of IV methylene blue, in case you can survive. And so I actually did see this in medical school. It's a last-ditch effort kind of thing, because these very, very high doses of methylene blue, instead of becoming a redox cycler, which means it cycles electrons, which we can talk about, it becomes a pro-oxidant specifically only at these very high doses, and it causes a significant amount of vascular constriction. And that is supposedly, we're trying to help people with severe vasodilation related to shock. So
with the before we get into kind of the electron transport chain and how it works in the redox state and all that, is like I've noticed sometimes when I take methylene blue, sometimes at the same dose my urine will be really blue, sometimes it won't. Is that an indicator of what your body's using, or is it just a hydration thing?
So it could be both. It certainly could be a hydration thing. The less hydrated you are, the more blue your urine's likely going to be. If you've had B vitamins or something else that's going to make your urine yellow, then it might be a neon green, for example, which could be surprising. So just, surprise. And so that could be part of it. The other piece, and we're still trying to work this out, Thomas, because in the beginning, I felt that people under more of an oxidative load, more stress, more inflammation, they required more methylene blue to be present and then to be converted. So meaning that, so there's two different states. This is the redox states of methylene blue. You have an oxidized form and a reduced form. When methylene blue is oxidized, it can pick up free electrons, just like an antioxidant would. When it's reduced, it can donate electrons, just like NAD or FAD, which are the electron donators to our electron transport chain in our mitochondria. And so what happens is when it's oxidized, it's the blue color that you see when you take it, that is oxidized. Okay. And then you have the reduced form when it gets more electrons that bind to it. That is when it becomes called leukomethylene blue, or basically colorless methylene blue. So the idea in my mind was, well, if you have more oxidative load, you're going to have to reduce more methylene blue to be able to combat, that oxidative load, right? And so as a result of that, you'd have colorless urine. So you would need more methylene blue to get the blue urine overall. But what we've noticed is that it also depends on the route of administration, for example. So if you swallow methylene blue, it seems to be that is actually the case. But if you dissolve it in your mouth, like as a troche, for example, in here, then it doesn't actually work the same way. And I think it's because it works faster up here. So you don't have as much capacity in the sense that because it works so fast, it's going to go in the urine faster is what it comes down to. So, but that's not a bad thing because it's going to be working faster up here as well if you need it. But in general, what I've seen from people, and anecdotally for me, I need more when I travel. I need more when I'm stressed to find that I have blue urine. But that doesn't seem to be across the board, though. There's some variability there.
Yeah, I mean that's generally been kind of my protocols. Like the more stressed I am, the more I increase dose or things like that. And then I try to, if everything's copacetic and everything's cool, then I'll take a couple days off or whatever. Just
totally. Yeah.
Now, what you mentioned, it's works along the electron transport chain, and that it can be a very complex thing for people to wrap their head around. It's you said it's an electron donor and an electron carrier, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
What does that really mean in human terms?
So in human terms, we eat, especially our fats and our carbohydrates, so that we can make electrons or take electrons from our food and then shuttle those electrons into our mitochondria, which are our energy producing factories. Most people know that the energy producing factory, the mitochondria, they've heard that before, like the batteries of our cell, the powerhouse of our cell. And so in essence, we're eating those particular types of food, and proteins are kind of like our last ditch if we need them as well. But fats and carbohydrates, they go into something called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle in our mitochondria. And the Krebs cycle has all these various steps along the way that allow us to take electrons from our food. And they take electrons and they carry them on NAD and FAD. So NADH and FADH. And everybody's heard of NAD. Everybody's excited about NAD, right? That's all I hear these days. But NADH and FADH, what they do is once they picked up electrons from our food on these intermediate cycles that I learned in medical school, but just memorized and forgot about, but now I know them a lot more from a clinical perspective. What happens is that these electrons go into the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. So the electron transport chain is a 4-protein complex chain of proteins that allows these electrons to flow through it. And as these electrons are flowing through it, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, complex 4 is called cytochrome oxidase. A lot of people know that, or some people do. As these electrons are flowing through, you're creating what's called a proton gradient. You're creating a gradient between the outer membrane of the mitochondria and the inner membrane. So the mitochondria has a double membrane. It's got like a fully external one, and then it has an internal one as well. So you have spaces between those membranes. Okay, and so what you're doing there is you're creating what's called a proton gradient. As the electrons are flowing through, it's creating enough energy to push protons or H+ across a membrane against resistance, basically. And then what happens at the end of that is that electrons flow through, and their final stop is complex 4, where they get picked up by oxygen. Oxygen's our final electron acceptor at complex 4. And then those protons come through ATP synthase, which is our rotor that creates ATP in our cells. And so complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, complex 5 technically is ATP synthase. That's our actual rotor. Like RPM wise, it's like 6,000 RPM. It's a really, really fast and very, very strong motor. And I just learned this a little while ago. You're making about like 150, 160 pounds of ATP every single day. And this is not something that stays around for very long. We're utilizing it all the time, but it's a huge amount of ATP. And the places that make the most, obviously, are going to be our brain, our heart, our liver, our musculoskeletal tissue, and then our gonads, our eggs, and our sperm. Actually, sperm and eggs have the most mitochondria per cell out of any cell, and then our brain has the second most out of there after that. And then there's only one cell in our body that does not have mitochondria. Do you know what that is?
No.
It's the red blood cell. So the red blood cells used to have mitochondria, but they got rid of their mitochondria so they could carry more oxygen. So that's just a fun fact over there. But the problem, as you know, Thomas, is that 94% of the US population has some element of mitochondrial dysfunction, meaning that they don't have the ability to either make the energy well, because the other part of it that I didn't talk about is when you make energy, not only do you make ATP, you also make what are called, quote unquote, waste products of energy metabolism. Carbon dioxide, not really a waste product. This has been hammered into me over the years now. It's actually a signaling molecule and very, very important. Water, and what are called reactive oxygen species. So these are free radicals. This is oxidative stress. People have heard of these words before. We make some of this because it's a feedback loop to have a better sense of what's happening in our mitochondria in real time. So our mitochondria is always has tons of feedback loops. tons of understanding of how much energy to make, how much energy not to make. Should it rev it up? Should it decrease it? Should it release something like nitric oxide to get more substrate, like more glucose or more fat to the area to make more energy? And so what's happening here is that you have this reactive oxygen species that can build up, and you need to have antioxidants in the body to be able to compensate for the reactive oxygen species that you make. And so the problem is that metabolic dysfunction, the inability to do any of this, either make energy from your food or detox from the energy that you make, causes dysfunction. And so 94% of the US population is dealing with something and some element of this. And this is why methylene blue can be so powerful, because it works on both sides. It works on the side to help you make energy, and it helps you on the detox side too.
Dang. I mean, is it something where you found people, how quickly can it rescue that metabolic function?
Almost immediately in people. I mean, that's the crazy thing about it. When I first learned about methylene blue a while ago, and we started using it, I just kept getting these calls from patients or from friends, and they would just be telling me, I've been feeling terrible for months, years. And then I took methylene blue, and then 5 days later, my joint pain was gone. My blood pressure was better. My brain was turned back on. And initially I was like, that's not possible. It can't be happening that quickly. But as I went through the research and the literature, what happens with so many people is that they have blockages in those complexes. They have blockages in complex 1 and complex 2, especially. Complex 1 is actually one of the main ones that's destroyed or dysfunctional when you get an infection that doesn't go away, or like you have mold exposure, or you have severe stress, or medications. Even a fun and very popular medication called metformin actually has a destructive capacity to complex 1. So I take issue with metformin for this reason. And I think if you're going to take it, you probably need to cycle it. And if you exercise a lot, you probably don't need it. That's just my 2 cents on metformin. But anyway, it's destroying complex 1. And so what methylene blue does, it can compensate for any of the destruction that's happening in any of these complexes and either reboot them. It can recycle NAD, for example. So if you have a complex 1 that's not working very well, ideally what's supposed to happen is that NADH is supposed to donate electrons and become NAD after it goes to complex 1. But if your complex 1's not working very well, then you're not going to be able to donate those electrons, right? So then the whole system gets stuck. So what methylene blue can do is it can take those electrons from NADH, recycle it back to NAD+, so it can go back to the citric acid cycle, pick up more electrons. And then what methylene blue can do with those electrons is they can donate it to further down the chain, so to complex 3 or complex 4. And that's why it's so powerful, is that it's doing this sort of compensatory mechanism. And at the same time, there's evidence that it can help regeneration with some of the complexes, especially complex 4 in mitochondria, which is another one that's often damaged because of infection, stress. I didn't talk about why do people have mitochondrial dysfunction? Infections, stress, medications, toxins in our environment, anything from the food that we eat to the stuff we're putting on our skin. And of course, number 1 is going to be insulin resistance. So if you're insulin resistant, your whole mitochondria do not like to play. And because they just have too much substrate, they have too much glucose, and they're trying to downregulate their efficiency so that they don't have to make as much energy because it's too energy dense, right? And so all of these things are happening. The mitochondria aren't working well, and you bring in methylene blue. It reboots your mitochondria. It compensates for complex dysfunction. And on the other side of it, all that oxidative stress, all that reactive oxygen species, low doses of methylene blue can directly act like an antioxidant because they can pick up those free electrons that's what reactive oxygen species are. They're unpaired electrons, either oxygen with only 1 electron instead of 2, sometimes 3, but usually just 1. Hydroxyl radicals, hydrogen peroxide. These are all oxidative molecules that can build up in the system. We need these, but the problem is so many of us are antioxidant deficient. So we don't have enough vitamin D. We don't have enough melatonin, which is really important in our mitochondria, alpha lipoic acid, vitamin C, and others that are there to help compensate for that oxidative load. Glutathione, of course, as well.
So do you become dependent on it then, or does it have a rescue effect that can take effect even after the methylene blue is no longer being used? I mean, essentially, if you're sort of restarting that cycle, or initially you're kind of having to use that methylene blue to sort of kickstart everything, get things going. Yeah. But could you come off of it and restore some of that function?
That's exactly what I like to try to do, right? Because the way I always think about this is that as a clinician, I'm working with patients to try to help them right now while they're on the longer path to optimizing their health. The beautiful thing about methylene blue is you can bring it into the system very, very early, even in people that are really sick, chronic complex medical illness. Yes, you can use it for them, also for endurance athletes and things which we've spoken about before. But you can bring it in early and you can start seeing the benefits very quickly. Their energy is better, their detox capacities are better, their brain fog, their inflammation, et cetera, all getting better. But the key always is methylene blue is a great compound that will help regenerate the mitochondria to some degree, but it's not going to work as well as stop eating McDonald's and drinking alcohol every night. Stop being so stressed all the time. Maybe don't sleep next to a partner that's snoring and keeping you up all night. Get a sleep divorce, whatever it might be. Like work on. So I always couch it this. I always caution my patients. I'm like, look, methylene blue is going to be fantastic. We're going to see some amazing benefits very quickly once we find the right dose, and titration is important. We can talk about all that. But it doesn't take the place of doing the things that we need to do on a daily basis to keep these human avatars, these meat suits, working in these environments that we have. Like we have lighting, we're going to be on airplanes, we're going to be more stressed. Methylene blue is always going to be helpful in those cases, I think, because all of us have more stress on top of our regular stress regularly. So for me, like when I travel, I'm going to take more methylene blue. Am I going to take it all the time when I'm home? No. If I'm doing the things, if I'm being optimized, if I'm sleeping well, what I do is I check mitochondrial function over time. Like you can check various aspects of your mitochondria over time and see how well you're doing. And then for me, what I've seen, at least in my patients as well, is like once you get methylene blue on board, once you titrate it and find the right dose, you're regenerating the mitochondria using the methylene blue. And then you're supporting it with optimizing your vitamins, your minerals, your nutrients, your diet, your lifestyle, your stress, your behavior, everything there. And then you could peel it off over time. And your dose, as you mentioned, also can get lower and lower and lower. So oftentimes when I'm starting people, it's a ramp up of dose. We get to a dose, and then over time, once we get them relatively well optimized, then we start ramping it down because you need less over time because your mitochondria are more optimized.
Interesting. What about, this is a little tangential for a second, but I know my wife has experienced that during PMS, she increases her dose. She feels better during that. Is there any evidence there, or is that just like, hey, there's just more stress load coming on at that time?
Well, I think there's two things there. I think there's certainly more stress and there's more oxidative stress as a result of that. So there's going to be more inflammatory burden overall as the body is trying to now get rid of lining that it doesn't need, right? As a result of there's a huge inflammatory load that happens to create the sloughing of, everybody loves that word, sloughing.
It's a gnarly word.
It's like moist. People hate that word too.
Yeah.
That's my brother's least favorite word is moist. Sorry, I said it. How many times did I say it? Sorry. Should I say sloughing one more time? Just kidding. All right, I did. But as it's sloughing off, damn it, what other word do you say? Anyway, that's like the medical word we use, but that's causing an inflammatory stress in self. And so methylene blue is going to help with that inflammatory stress, mitochondrial stress that's happening. The other piece of this, which is interesting, and we can go there if you want now or later, is there is a mood boosting effect to methylene blue. Not only is it enhancing mitochondrial function and compensating for these complex dysfunctions as we talked about, and also helping with the detox side of things. And in addition to that, it's what I would say there is I'm going to talk about it being a monoamine oxidase inhibitor in a minute, but because it does increase mood and boost that, there is what I would call with methylene blue is if you start off in a low enough dose and you increase the dose slowly over time, it's like, I call it more like an adaptogen overall. An adaptogen in the sense that, do you need more detox capacity? There you go. Do you need more energy enhancing capacity? That's what it's going to do first. And then it'll do that and compensate for what you need first as you ramp up the dosing overall.
So as you potentially ramp up dosing, it might expand the scope and what it can do.
Exactly, yeah. And so, but it seems to do what it's required of you first. If you need more antioxidant capacity first, it's going to work there.
That would make sense.
If you need more energy enhancement because your complexes aren't working very well. And so people should know, like, what do you mean not working very well, right? This is symptomatically what are you going to feel? You're going to feel brain fog, concentration problems. You're going to have fatigue and memory problems. You might have liver detox issues, or you might have issues with exercise-induced fatigue. So you work out, but then you feel so fatigued in your muscles that you can't move for maybe a couple hours, or maybe some of my patients a couple days, really. Yeah. These are all signs of mitochondrial stress overall and mitochondrial dysfunction. And infertility is a big one too. I mean, in infertility rates are going up dramatically, and the end process, and there's a lot of reasons why, but is the mitochondrial dysfunction overall. But to your wife, since I'm talking about the eggs again, is there's the other piece of methylene blue that's important, and that it also works as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And I mentioned that earlier when we were talking about antipsychotics, and so the first antipsychotic actually designed or developed was actually derived from methylene blue. And interestingly enough, it was called chlorpromazine, and we don't use it anymore, thank God. But because it has a lot of other issues that are not related to methylene blue at all. But the thing about the psychiatric medications is that back in the 1940s and 50s when they were developing them, what they would do is they compounded the new psychiatric medications with the methylene blue, which means that they put them together in the same compound, in the same pill. And they did that because they wanted to make sure that the psychiatric patients were taking their psychiatric medications, because if they did, their urine would be blue, for example. So, but interestingly enough, now methylene blue has this new life actually, as we now understand, as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor on its own, and the benefits that are a result of that, which we can get into if you'd like.
Well, what is an MAOI?
Yeah. So a monoamine oxidase inhibitor is something that prevents the breakdown of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. It prevents the breakdown of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. And so some of the older drugs, the very old drugs, antidepressants, were MAOIs, but they were very bad because they were what called irreversible MAOIs, and they would cause you to have lots of side effects of things like cheese and wine and chocolate and things like that. And they had other medication side effects. So those medications have kind of went out of favor, and then they have your SSRIs and your SNRIs, and which are the serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Now there's much more interest in the GABAergic neurotransmitter system and causing and being attributed and having a significant correlation to depression, anxiety, insomnia, and things like that. We know that depression is not a serotonin deficiency, side note. But in any respect, MAOIs were developed initially for that reason, and then they came out of favor because of those side effects. But the thing about methylene blue is that it's a very short-acting MAOI and a very mild one overall, especially at lower doses. But it can be very helpful. It's actually been studied at low doses at like 16 milligrams for depression and bipolar disorder. And part of that, of course, is the mood-boosting aspect of having more norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin around. But we also know from a lot of mental health disorders have significant amount of mitochondrial dysfunction as well. So working on the mitochondrial aspects is huge. And that's what actually got us interested in methylene blue, is that these very low doses were having this profound effect on mood, on mitochondrial function, on endurance. And we were just very surprised as we were doing a lot of the initial research into it. We saw a lot of research that was happening in models of Alzheimer's as well. There's a researcher down at University of Texas, Austin, named Francisco Gonzalez Lima. And he did a cool study where he actually, in animals, he did methylene blue low dose with near-infrared light and saw how methylene blue and near-infrared both could donate electrons directly to complex 4 in the mitochondria. So actually it was electrons with methylene blue, and it was photonic energy to complex 4 by near-infrared light, enhancing ATP production.
Interesting.
And so his idea was that Alzheimer's was a blood flow issue, right? And so there's actually been some interesting studies using methylene blue as a clearance for some of these amyloid proteins as well, interestingly enough, although the amyloid hypothesis is kind of dead right now, but amyloid itself is still a problem, we think. And I think that we think it's a problem because it's there because of another reason, not because it's there itself, right? There's amyloid builds up because of inflammation, infection, and things like that.
It's sort of like high blood sugar being a problem with insulin resistance, but not the high blood sugar isn't the initial cause.
Exactly.
It's just, it's there, and that's indicative of something else going on.
Exactly. And that's what the amyloid is at this point. So there's been some studies now looking at Alzheimer's and methylene blue, for example, with some pretty profound benefits at very low doses. And this is actually a really interesting study because they had 3 arms of the study. One was given 8 milligrams twice daily. One was given of methylene blue. One was given 75 milligrams twice daily, and one was given 150 milligrams twice daily of methylene blue. So we haven't talked about dosing a lot, which we can do, but what happens is as you get to like higher doses of methylene blue, not only are you increasing the redox capacity, but you're also making the system react with its own antioxidant capacity as well. And the reason for that is that higher doses of methylene blue, over about a milligram per kilogram, which is about 150 pounds in a human, is going to increase the amount of hydrogen peroxide that you make in the system. And people get scared about hydrogen peroxide, but we make hydrogen peroxide all the time in our cells. And this is really one of our main antimicrobial stimuli in the system is to make hydrogen peroxide. So our immune cells make hydrogen peroxide, our lysosomes make hydrogen peroxide, which is part of our cell that kills bugs as an antimicrobial. And so at these higher doses, about a milligram per kilogram, which is about 70 kilograms or about 150 pounds, that's when you start getting this antimicrobial effect of methylene blue, usually, especially for acute stuff. And you get more hydrogen peroxide production, which is the cause of the antimicrobial effect. Okay. So, but that also, at the same time, because you're making more hydrogen peroxide, that stimulates a pathway in our body called the NRF2 pathway. NRF2 pathway is our pathway that gets upregulated when we need to make more glutathione, because glutathione is our master antioxidant. And so the problem is that how many people are glutathione deficient? A lot. How many people with Alzheimer's and a brain that's already significantly stressed are going to be glutathione deficient? The answer is probably the majority, but they don't test for this, right? And so this study, they did 8 milligrams twice a day, 75 and 150 twice a day. 8 milligrams twice a day was the placebo. They gave the 8 milligrams twice a day because they wanted the urine to be blue for everybody, because we want everybody to look like they were getting the same dose. The placebo group, in quotes, the 8 milligrams twice a day, did significantly better in the study from a memory, focus, retention, every cognitive score that they did, compared to the 75 and the 150. And this is, in my estimation, because they were given too much methylene blue without understanding their redox and their antioxidant status. And that's a big deal. And that's why, we're very, and I'm very, and from a clinical perspective, very adamant that most of the products out there are overdosing people. I mean, not like, I don't think it's going to be like an overdose, like you need to go to the hospital kind of thing, but it's more overdose in the sense of you have to go low and slow under most circumstances, unless it's an acute indication, like an acute stress, acute trauma, acute infection. From an antimicrobial perspective, there's good studies on using methylene blue in animals for traumatic brain injury, for stroke. And so I have all my patients have higher strength methylene blue in their medicine cabinet just in case. But my go-to for the most part is going to be a lower dose from a mitochondrial perspective and from a mood boosting perspective too. Yeah.
So with pivot over to performance for just a minute, because I think these kind of performance isn't just for an athlete. Performance is, there's a practical application for performance, but then there's like a reason why it's helping you perform, which is probably applicable to a regular person that's not an athlete as well.
Yeah.
So is it just giving you more energy during a workout, or is there an oxygenation aspect? How is it kind of helping performance? Because we're seeing this particularly in the endurance world, but now I'm starting to see it come out a little bit more in the CrossFit setting, in the kind of, more anaerobic world too.
Yeah, we talked about it last time, but in brief, I work with an ultra marathoner that does 100 milers, and he was doing one in Leadville, which is the biggest and I think the tallest 100 miler in the world, these ultra marathons. And he cut off 3 hours of his time working with me and just using methylene blue while he was running. He also used glutamine, which we talked about in another video, I know, as well. And that didn't give him, so he didn't have as much diarrhea, which is good news. But it was, my estimation, it was the methylene blue that really helped him, because it was helping his aerobic capacity. And aerobic capacity, what I mean by that, and most of your listeners I likely know this, is that maintain the ability to allow yourself to continue to use your mitochondria to make energy for longer. Okay. And so your mitochondria require oxygen, right? And so that's why we call it aerobic capacity. Methylene blue, what it can do, we talked about compensating for all these protein complex dysfunctions. What it can also do is it can donate electrons, it can accept electrons just like oxygen in your mitochondria, which means that it can be the final electron acceptor just like oxygen. So if you don't have as much oxygen around, or you're losing it, or you have less of it because you've been doing 100 miles, or not even that, like less than that from an endurance perspective, you'll see that what methylene blue can do is compensate for that lack of oxygen around, and you give yourself more aerobic capacity as a result of that. And I have a couple of my patients, this happened a while ago when I first started using methylene blue, just as kind of a trial to see with mitochondrial function, et cetera. I was talking to one of my patients, and she's like, well, I refuse to not have it on board when I'm working out in the morning and doing my cardio. And then I asked her why. She's like, well, I can keep my heart rate up longer for like another 10 or 15 minutes, more than I would be able to if I didn't have the methylene blue around. And this kind of piqued my interest significantly. I'm like, well, if this is happening, that means your aerobic capacity is elevated. And this makes a whole lot of sense because of how methylene blue is working. And so, I live in Colorado, which is at 5,000 feet. And so, or anybody that's listening, if you're on an airplane, you're pressurized to 8,000 feet above sea level, so that the airplane is lighter than being at sea level. And 8,000 feet above sea level, you have about 14 to 16% oxygen in the air that you're breathing. And so that's not a lot of oxygen. And that's one of the reasons why people feel when they travel, is that their oxygen is low and their cells go into like holy shit mode, like where's the oxygen? And they get more inflammation and more oxidative stress. And then you get shitty air on an airplane, or you get the shitty food. Hopefully you don't eat the food on an airplane anymore. Nobody does it anymore, I hope, right? And then and you also get the people that are around you, that are sick or whatever. And so methylene blue is protecting you because it's allowing you more aerobic capacity. And it's also, antimicrobial and it's also anti-inflammatory. So it's all these other benefits. Now, of course, you come to Colorado, we have beautiful air, usually, so you don't have to worry about the air, but you are at 5,000 feet. So everybody that comes to my house, that comes to visit, gets methylene blue. And we're actually now testing it. I have a couple high level endurance athletes that do high peaks in Colorado. So we're gonna be testing methylene blue in some of these athletes. And it's gonna be a lot of fun to see how it goes. But in anecdotal so far, it's been a game changer for many of them. So if you're going to altitude, I would always take methylene blue with you.
So from an anaerobic perspective, is it probably just helping anaerobic performance because it's increasing your ability to recover at a higher heart rate in the periods of time that you're coming out of anaerobic?
There you go. That's exactly it. So like from an anaerobic, I use it after because it's a great recovery tool as you allow the hormetic stress of the anaerobic activity to do its thing. Then after that, or even as that's happening at the end of it, that's when you want to bring in methylene blue. And it's a really good point you mentioned, because I get this question all the time, especially if you're thinking about pairing methylene blue with other types of modalities. If you're thinking about red light, obviously I just mentioned that's a good synergy there. Like I get a lot of questions about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, for example. And I get a question, well, should you use methylene blue before hyperbarics or should you use it after, for example? And I often say, well, what are you using it for? And do you need more mitochondrial support? Or is it more that you want the hormetic stress of the hyperbaric chamber at deeper pressures? And then this is going to cause a huge amount of oxidative load, just like anaerobic activity would, and then you'd use methylene blue as a recovery tool. And so I use it both ways. But in essence, pre-endurance work and post-anaerobic work.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at sort of the entire reason for building your aerobic capacity for most athletes that are not endurance athletes is the ability to be able to, I've always kind of looked at it like this. If you're running on flat ground and then all of a sudden you run on an incline, suddenly you're going anaerobic. And then when you reach the top of that hill, then you're waiting for your aerobic system to come back and take over, right? So you win anaerobic. How quickly can you get back to aerobic, right? That's like, I've always joked that's kind of my definition of fitness, is how quickly can you get back to aerobic after anaerobic? And the idea of training zone 2 is training yourself so that you've built base, so your base is higher, so you're capable of recovering at 120 beats per minute rather than having to wait until you're down to 70 or 80, right? Mm-hmm. So it would make sense that even potentially for anaerobic activity, taking methylene blue potentially could help you recover between anaerobic sets faster if it's allowing you to recover at a higher heart rate, so you could decrease your rest time between sets, or I say sets, but even like CrossFit's a great example of doing something like a high wattage 20 calorie echo bike or a row,
right?
And then you're going to go into a deadlift after that. If you can decrease the amount of time that you need to recover between those two modalities, that's the difference between winning and losing.
I love that. You just gave me a really interesting idea with the sense of like, it may be that you can do more, and I've thought about this on the hyperbaric side before, like you can do more anaerobic work for longer. Mm-hmm. Basically, let me rephrase. It's going to take you more work to get anaerobic if you have methylene blue on board, maybe, right? And as a result of that, if you're able to do more anaerobic work because of that, because you had to work harder to get there. Like, are you able to build more as a result of that? And then can you recover more on the other end of it because you have the methylene blue on board to help with that recovery period between sets?
Yes,
that's a cool idea. I didn't think about that.
It's the same concept of someone that is fat adapted.
Yeah.
They they stay aerobic for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily change their peak performance, but it changes how long it can, and I'll get to that in a second, but it doesn't necessarily acutely change their peak performance, but it would change if someone is fat adapted, for example, because their mitochondria is just more efficient, then they're able to stay aerobic to, let's just hypothetically say 85% of max heart rate. So they're only having this 15% little delta that they have to be anaerobic,
right?
Which would mean that you can go longer because you're only tapping into that carbohydrate store for 15% of the time versus, say, hypothetically 20% of the time or 25% of the time. So that means you could do more sets before you'd actually be at complete exhaustion. You could go longer.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's another colleague that you know as well, Brian McKenzie, that does a lot of work with hypoxic training, and he does a lot of CO2 retention. And he's been doing a lot of work with, he and I have been chatting about hypoxic training, then doing endurance work with methylene blue on board. Yep. And this makes a lot of sense, right? You're becoming more hypoxic. You're creating a stress in the system that says, I need more oxygen. And then you have methylene blue on board. And he's seen his VO2 max go up 5 to 10 points when he checks it. I mean, in short order, right? Yeah. And for longer endurance work. So I think there's something here, right? In the sense of the between set recovery, the additional anaerobic work, the long distance aerobic work, the endurance work. And this is all being worked out now because there haven't really been a lot of studies on this. And that is a big thing because, methylene blue has been around such a long time. Nobody wants to do anything with it because it doesn't have, like from a pharmaceutical perspective, because there's no patent at the end of the rainbow for them to get a blockbuster drug, that kind of thing. But I think that's the beauty of it. We have this capacity now to use this and really modulate it. And we're seeing it. I'm seeing it in clinical practice all the time across this whole spectrum, from people that are super, super, super sick to people that are really healthy and just trying to optimize it on the endurance side too. Yeah.
An important question that people have brought up, and I know Dr. Paul Saladino mentioned this in a video. Do you turn down? I think I always look at things from an enabling perspective anyway. So it's a good question. I think about like a good example is you don't want to typically take a high amount of vitamin C or antioxidants post-workout, right? Because you want to enable the body to be able to produce its own, SOD and everything that it needs to be able to do the job. So if you're taking things like methylene blue over time, do you downregulate your body's own capacity from an antioxidant perspective, but also from an ATP perspective? Like, are you making it so that, hey, I'm providing this additional source of energy in a way?
Yeah.
Once I remove it, does that downregulate, and do I feel sluggish, and do I decrease ATP?
I mean, the first thing to say here about Paul's video was that 94%, as I mentioned, of the US population has an element or significant amount. There's a spectrum of mitochondrial dysfunction. So there's very few people out there that have purely amazingly optimized mitochondria and that don't, I think, benefit from methylene blue on at least an intermittent basis. Okay, and these are all going to be under more stress. We're all going to be under bad lighting, airplanes, and those kinds of things. So like to take that out of the way for a minute and say, I think that most of us can benefit from using methylene blue at very low doses, titrating to find a right dose, intermittently at the very least. But you asked a really good question, which is, when you stop methylene blue, does it have this rebound effect at all? Do you have this effect where you're antioxidant depleted because you had methylene blue on board and then you didn't replete your antioxidants enough ahead of time and then you take it away? So the answer is that if you're optimizing over time, you will need less methylene blue, and you will feel that over time too. You will feel that you need less to get the same benefit because you're optimizing everything else in your life. And you'll know when you need it more because you'll be like, oh, I'm more stressed. I have stuff going on in my life. My kids' soccer games are making me scream. I told you about that. Those kinds of things, and stress me out. I don't get stressed out by many things, but my daughter's soccer game, somehow I do still. But anyway, so you'll find over time this sort of reverse tolerance thing for many people, which means that you need less and less over time. And what I found is that if you're optimizing the system, your vitamins, your minerals, your nutrients, your cofactors, your behavior, your lifestyle, like you're not going to need as much, and you're going to be able to peel it off and only use it intermittently over time. So I have not seen clinically anybody stop methylene blue and start feeling like it just hasn't happened. I haven't anybody said, I've been taking methylene blue I've had people taking methylene blue for years now, and they don't take it for a week. They feel okay. Usually if they're using it for that long a period of time, it's because they have significant mitochondrial stress. Yeah. So some of their symptoms may come back, but it's not like we're seeing, especially in higher end people, we're not seeing especially intermittent use. Like if people are using it more intermittently, especially, there's no issues, right? If you're like an elite athlete, and well, let's say this, if you're a well-optimized athlete and you're great at your recovery, you have optimized oxidative status, you shouldn't be taking methylene blue every day. You should be taking it intermittently for the days that you're going to be putting yourself under more stress. Okay. But if you're not well optimized, which is most people, then these lower doses, 4, 8 milligrams, can go a long way to supporting the system. And then you can use higher doses when you have more stress. But in essence, I have not seen clinically people stopping methylene blue and having a detrimental effect to that. But if they're on high doses of it, they're on like 50, 75 milligrams or something like that, which is rare, then I don't usually like to stop them cold turkey. you want to slowly wean them down over time. I mean, in essence, I only use those higher doses, like 1 milligram to 2 milligrams per kilogram. So like 150 to 250 milligrams of methylene blue. I only use that for more acute stress, like acute trauma, acute ischemic episodes, which are rare, but I have my patients have them in their medicine cabinet just in case. Again, not something that would preclude you from going to the hospital, of course, but this is something that I have all my patients have just in case. Acute infection as well, as an antimicrobial, it can be really, really good like that. And so, but in essence, if you're on those higher doses, you want to wean people down instead of just stopping them. Yeah. But if you're at 4, 8, 12, 16 milligrams, these are low doses, and most people can come off them just fine.
Well, how does someone titrate their dose? How do they find their appropriate dose?
So if you're looking at it for like a mitochondrial optimization goal, so your mitochondria aren't working well, remember you have brain fog, you have concentration problems, fatigue, you have muscle fatigue with exercise. These are mitochondrial symptoms overall. So in essence, what I do with almost everybody is that I start titrating at very low doses, around 4 to 8 milligrams of methylene blue. And I have them increase the dose every 3 to 5 days until they start feeling better. Now, what does better mean? That depends on the person, right? If it's just slightly better, maybe their mood is a little bit better, but they don't have the symptomatic relief that we're looking for, then we continue to go up on the dose. The average for most people we found is between 8 and 25 milligrams of methylene blue. Like that is the sweet spot from a mitochondrial optimization perspective.
Which is way less than some of these like liquid ones you find on Amazon and things like that. Like people are taking like 50, 60 milligrams sometimes.
Yeah, then that's a big problem, I think, is that you don't need those higher doses for the most part for the mitochondrial piece. Now, if you have a severe issue, maybe those higher doses are going to be necessary. And so that's why I say it's always a titration game. So for my patients, I always start off there. But in some people, I do need to go up to 35, 37.5, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams. And I do use that, but that's very rare. Most of the time, it's going to be these lower doses that are super helpful. And then once you find the dose that works for you, then it's a question of how long you stay on it. And that question really goes to another question is why are you taking it in the first place? And what kind of symptomatic relief have you had? What else are you doing to support the mitochondria at the same time so that you can wean yourself off of it? But in essence, once I find the right dose for patients, then I keep it on for at least 2 weeks, typically at that dose. And then depending on the situation, I'll start weaning them down from there, if I can. Oftentimes, usually, the shortest is 2 weeks, but usually it's more like 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks kind of thing for more people that have more chronic issues. Yeah. And then we can start weaning them down after that. But the one thing that people have to always, and the reason why it's so important, I think, to go low doses is that because it has this mild MAOI effect, this monoamine oxidase effect, the neurotransmitter ecosystem is going to change a little bit. And so when that's changing, it's important that you understand that it's going to change and that you go slowly, because sometimes people can feel like the word I always get is funny. I feel funny, like just a little bit strange in the head overall. And that's because of the neurotransmitter ecosystem changing. But that usually goes away after the first couple days of trying it and then getting used to the dosing. But it can be a little bit unnerving for some people, especially if they start off at a too high of a dose. And I've had a couple people come to me at conferences after speaking and saying, my doctor gave me 50 milligrams. I felt so terrible. My brain, I got so depressed and I didn't know what to do. And this happened it's more than a handful at this point. And this is because their system just wasn't ready for that high of a dose from an MAOI perspective, from a mitochondrial perspective. And yes, maybe they needed that dose because they had an infection or they had severe mitochondrial stress, but you don't want to start there under most circumstances.
That was me when you first gave me my first
troche.
Yeah, you had given me a box, and I didn't realize you had given me the Tro Plus, and I took a full troche.
Oh no, okay.
And that's how I felt. I felt like I felt funny, like I couldn't focus, I couldn't like things. And I'm pretty metabolically optimized, so it was probably just way too much for me.
Yes.
And so I just like put it away. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to use this again. And then I looked at the difference between like the two packages you gave me. I was like, oh,
yeah.
Oh, and so then I took a quarter of a Just Blue, 4 milligrams.
Yeah, 4.
I'm like, and that was money. Like that was like, okay, this is what it's supposed to feel like.
Yeah.
And like I'm a metabolically optimized person. So for me, like 4 is all I really need. I just take 4, like usually 4 to 4 days a week-ish. And then I take 2 or 3 days off. And then the same kind of thing. And then if I travel, I'll take maybe 12 or 16, or for me in the wintertime, if I'm like in crappy lighting all the time and I'm not getting sunlight, people think it's the opposite because like obviously it works with UV and it works with light, which we can talk about in a second. But like in the summer, I actually take a little less. Like in the winter when I'm exposed to things, kids are bringing crap home every day and I'm under fluorescent lights and I'm not getting, that's when I increase my dose. And same thing on an airplane or just Yeah.
Well, you remember from our walk, one of our previous visits, where I had too much methylene blue on board, and we did 117,000 degrees in.
I mean,
it
was legit 111 degrees out.
It was hot,
Yeah.
and I couldn't figure out why I was getting heat stroke. Like you remember, we came back.
Well,
to
it was 111 degrees.
It was hot, but that, I'm used to heat stress, and so I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized that I had 16 milligrams of methylene blue on board because I was traveling to come see you, and I usually take 4 or 8 milligrams, and I hadn't had 16 in a while, and I had to completely do like a core body temperature downgrade. I covered myself in your frozen dog food packets. It was hysterical, but so be aware. This is important. Like as you're combining it with sunlight and heat stress, like you are going to make more energy. So you have to be aware of that. And so I had to very quickly, get my body temperature down so I didn't have to go to the hospital, which I was able to do fine because I knew what was happening. But it is something to be aware of, and I use more, and I recommend my patients use more in the winter as well.
Yeah. So what's, we'll link out down below to transcriptions because you guys are pretty unique, but it's an important thing to mention. A lot of products have heavy metals, a lot of things like that. It's like whether people choose transcriptions or not, which by the way, I do recommend it legitimately. It's the one that I use. It's the best, and I'll link out to it down below. But what do people need to look for in a methylene blue product? And I know, obviously, in full transparency, it's going to be you have a methylene blue
product,
company.
Yeah.
So full disclosure there.
Yeah.
But let's say people choose to not go with you guys.
Yeah.
What do they need to look for?
The first thing I always say is that it's like a plea. Please don't buy your supplements on Amazon. Please, because you just don't know what you're getting. You may think it's the company that you're getting it from, but oftentimes there's been millions and millions of dollars of crazy counterfeit on Amazon that I've heard of over the years. A company called Metagenics, for example, they had all these people getting rancid Metagenics products because they weren't actually Metagenics at all. They were coming from an Amazon warehouse. So my first recommendation is to not buy it from Amazon. Okay. The second recommendation is that if you're looking at methylene blue is a synthetic component. It's a synthetic compound. So it doesn't come from the earth. We talked about this. And so as part of the manufacturing process, it can be contaminated with lead, cadmium, mercury, and arsenic. And so you don't want any of that at all, right? And so you really want to make sure that the company that you're getting it from is testing for all of those. And so you should be able to get a certificate of analysis from your company, and they should be able to tell you that it doesn't have that stuff in it, okay? The next thing is that it may have something called a USP. USP is very important. USP is a pharmaceutical grade label for your methylene blue. But unfortunately, this does not make it so that it's heavy metal free or that it's actually the potency that you think it might be. So potency, what I mean by that is that, so if you get like a liquid methylene blue especially, and it says that you're getting, let's say 1 milligram per full dropper of methylene blue. We tested many liquids. We tested maybe 7 or 8 liquids. This is about a year ago. None of the liquids met label claim. So none of them even came close to being a milligram or whatever it was per dropper. They were about 80%, 60 to 80% of the label claim. So you're getting weaker methylene blue almost always. Actually, in one case, it was actually 125% more as well. So it was all over the map. So I really don't like liquid because it's very difficult to dose. It gets everywhere. It's very, very messy. And at the same time, the potency and the purity are all over the map. Okay. But if you're going to do it, make sure whatever your dose is, it's likely less than what you think it is. And when anybody's converting from liquid to one of our troches, I'm always saying, look, the troche is going to be stronger per milligram, because we precision dose everything and we test everything compared to what you're getting on the liquid side. And so we have to be mindful of that. And I have a lot of people that have come up to me over the years and say, oh, well, I took a liquid at this strength and I took yours at the same strength. It was like night and day. Yeah. And that's very, very common. So you have to watch out for purity. With the heavy metals, you have to watch out for potency, which is often a challenge with liquids. And the USP is not a blanket saying it's okay kind of thing. Even if they say USP methylene blue, ask for their certificate analysis. And this is the other thing. What we do, and this is so important because I'm a clinician, I'm using this with my patients, I'm using this with my family. I'm not going to just buy something online. And what we found over and over and over again, it's just so important to tell your patients that with methylene blue, they'll start low and go slow. number one. Make sure you're getting it from a reputable source, and that it's really important that you know that the bioavailability is really, really good. So like, even though we have troches that dissolve in the mouth, you can swallow it as well. And you can get the same mitochondrial benefits, but the troche is going to be faster. So a lot of people don't want to have a blue mouth, and that's okay. What I always say is if you're going to swallow it, make sure you swallow it on an empty stomach, and then eat about 15 or 20 minutes later, because that's going to help kind of push it in and make it work faster. That being said, if you have a lot of cognitive issues, a lot of brain fog, concentration issues, memory, if you dissolve in your mouth, even though your mouth will be blue, it's going to work faster that way. And that's a good thing if you have those kinds of issues, right? So bioavailability for most compounds is not 100% if you swallow it, but which means that the whole amount that you take in is being used by the body. Oftentimes we take things like a regular supplement, like I always give the example of NAC, which is 10% bioavailable. So if you take 100 milligrams of NAC, you only get 10 milligrams in the body. If you take 16 milligrams of methylene blue, you're going to get just about 16 milligrams in the body, which is good. But the key with that all is that you're thinking about, how you're going to deliver it, the dosing, and then one thing I forgot to mention is I keep losing this part of it. So when you're talking about certificates of analysis, I want to go back to that for a second. What we do at our company at Transcriptions is that all of our products, all the ingredients come with a certificate of analysis already, but we don't trust that. We do it ourselves, and we check our own certificate analysis to make sure that it is the purity and potency that the manufacturer of the ingredient told us that it was. And we've had to throw out thousands of dollars worth of material because of this. And it's crazy because no other companies are doing this. They just get the certificate of analysis from the ingredient company and go, okay, let's make it, right? But no, we don't do that. We test it again to make sure the purity and potency is as is.
One last question. It's, you can get, if you're metabolically healthy, especially, you feel, well, I guess everybody does, you feel a nice lift in energy from methylene blue. Any issues with taking the afternoon? Does it interfere with sleep? Anything like that? I
usually recommend dosing it. If you can dose it twice a day, dose it about 8 o'clock in the morning or whenever you wake up, and maybe 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. That being said, I do have patients that take it before they go to sleep, and they have no problem sleeping with it. In fact, because sleep is so metabolically active, as I think most people understand now that especially REM sleep is very metabolically active in the brain, they actually find they sleep better. And they get really good poops in the morning. That's what they tell me. This is like 5 different people. Like, I poop so much better after I take methylene blue at night. Like, oh, okay, interesting. This must be related to some sort of sympathetic autonomic nervous system balance and helping with metabolic energy and inflammation. I don't know. But in essence, because it has an effect on those neurotransmitters, the norepinephrine and dopamine specifically, I usually recommend when you first start it, try it in the morning, see how you feel. And then if you're going to dose it again, maybe 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. That's typically what I do. I'll take it maybe 4 milligrams in the morning and another 4 milligrams in the afternoon, especially if I have a longer day. Sometimes I'll take a combination of methylene blue with nicotine, caffeine, and CBD, like one of the other products that we have in the morning. And then I'll take the methylene blue pure, the Just Blue in the afternoon, just because that's a nice ride for the end of the day without having the stimulation of the nicotine and caffeine. So that's a couple different options.
I do have one more question. What about jet lag protocol? Because I know that's something that you've helped me with, using methylene blue just as a jet lag protocol.
Oh, this is so glorious. This has been like a game changer for me and for my patients as well, and for people that are using it. So methylene blue, as we mentioned, protects against altitude challenges, the hypoxic nature of it, the inflammatory nature of it, the air, the water, the people, toxic people. I can only protect you so much from toxic people, but methylene blue, but it helps a little bit. Helps a little bit. So the idea with methylene blue is that it's going to help protect you in all these ways. And so, on our website, if you go to our blogs, you can find a whole jet lag protocol. But in essence, what you want to do is find the right methylene blue dosing for you already, hypothetically. So you kind of know what gives you energy, what kind of gives you good mood boost and those kinds of things. But in essence, it's usually higher doses when you travel than that. So, and then you want to have a little bit before you get on the airplane, about 4 hours before you get on the airplane, hypothetically, to kind of get your system ready. And then about every 4 to 6 hours when you're on the plane, you want to take more methylene blue, depending how long you're going to be on the plane for. And then, of course, it depends on if you're have an overnight flight or whatever it might be. So you have to think about the timing in the sense of if you're going to be getting to someplace late, do you want to have a big dose of methylene blue before you get there? Probably not. So I use a lot of methylene blue and just in variable doses for people, but also when you get to your location, like when you get there, like the morning that you get to your new location, you're getting your methylene blue on board, and you're doing that for 3 to 5 days. When you get to your location, that's going to help reset your mitochondria to help support your mitochondria, while you're making this time shift or air shift or microbiota shift, everything else that's shifting when you travel. I also use a lot of GABAergic things as well when people travel, because people get super stressed when they're on airplanes, and that's not good for your parasympathetic nervous system. So use the GABA side, but just blue, pure methylene blue can go a long way to helping people. And it's been transformative for so many of my patients. And again, anybody that comes to Colorado that comes visit, they get the jet lag protocol, hands down.
No, it's definitely, that's probably the biggest thing I've noticed on the days that I fly. I don't feel crappy afterwards, which is pretty much every time I fly otherwise. So where can everyone find you, and where can everyone, I'll link out to transcriptions, but where can everyone find you guys?
So we've been around. So the thing about transcriptions is that we were the first company to come out with a commercial product using methylene blue back in 2020. We have blogs, tons of blogs about methylene blue and all the various aspects that we spoke about today on our blog at transcriptions.com. And so we are the only company as well that has 4 doctors on the team, 4 practicing doctors, MDs, that are seeing patients in clinical practice. There are no other companies now. When we first started, we were one of 1. Now we're one of 70 or something like that, and that's totally fine. But we're still the only company that does the quality control, the purity and potency control, that has doctors on the team, that has the longevity, if you want to call that, in this world, been doing it as long as we have. So if you want to learn more about it, I would go to transcriptions.com. That's our website and our blog. On Instagram at transcriptions. That's a great place to go as well, of course. And then my personal Instagram is at Dr. Scott Sherr, DrScottSherr. And I do a lot of work there. I try to bring education out to the socials as best I can. And I have my own clinical practice as well that's based on our nonprofit. So we have a nonprofit called Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, or Home Hope for short. It's a nonprofit that's training practitioners like me to how to optimize health rather than focus on disease, and creating the first standard of care for health. There's a standard of care for every disease out there, but there's no standard of care for health. And so Home Hope is where Transcriptions got its start. Home Hope is the nonprofit where we train and educate clinicians, licensed and non-licensed, and where we help people right now on the path to optimizing their health is at Transcriptions.
Right on, man. Thanks, brother.
Good to see you.